The Dardenne Creek Cemetery, final resting place of the first pioneer families to come to the high prairie.
Coulter.
These Scots-Irish
Woodson.
settlers led
Hatcher.
the American westward movement
Randall.
and established the first site
Watson.
of the Dardenne Presbyterian Church, organized in 1819.
Buscemi.
Names
Howell.
carved on the stones
Pittman.
in the Dardenne Creek and
Gill.
Dardenne Prairie cemeteries.
Naylor. Edwards. Costa.
Together, they built a church
Callaway.
characterized by honor and righteousness.
Zuma.
This
Bates.
is the story of that church. One of the first Presbyterian congregations west of the Mississippi River.
From 1706, with the organization of the First Presbytery, the Presbyterian Church in the colonies grew rapidly. A synod was organized in 1717, and in 1729, the Westminster Confession of Faith and the larger and shorter catechisms were adopted as the doctrinal standards. The 1740s saw the Great Awakening in America under the preaching of Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. The Presbyterians were not entirely united in support of that revival, and in 1741 divided, until 1758, when the two groups, Old Side and New Side, came back together. It was during this period that both American and Presbyterian education took a big step forward with the Log College of William Tennant, which was to become Princeton University and Seminary. The American Revolution, begun in 1776, was viewed many ways in England, but some saw its Presbyterian roots. One referred to it as the Presbyterian Revolution, and others said, Cousin America has run off with a Presbyterian parson. This assessment may not be far from the truth. 12 signers of the Declaration of Independence were Presbyterians.
After the Revolutionary War, settlers spilled over the Appalachian Mountains into the Ohio Valley, and soon were at the western boundary of the new country. According to tradition, the High Prairie, as the Dardenne Prairie was sometimes called, took the name of a French-Canadian trapper, Toussaint Dardenne, who hunted the area as early as 1747. The English, in characteristic fashion, butchered the French Dardenne, reducing it by swallowing the sound to Dardenne or Dardenne. In 1769, Louis Blanchette, a French hunter and explorer, built a hunting and trapping headquarters at the point where the first creek flowed from the hills on the left bank of the Missouri River, above its junction with the Mississippi. He called it the Little Hills, Les Petites Côtes. Blanchette was commander of the post until 1793, and Les Petites Côtes was the accepted name until 1793, when the Spanish governor, Manuel Perez, granted permission to establish officially a church which he named San Carlos Borromeo, and decreed that the town should take its name after the church, thus San Carlos. The culture and language was predominantly French, and in 1800 it again became French territory. Saint Louis was still under the flag of Spain when the first white settlers came into Dardenne Prairie. These newcomers were primarily of Scots-Irish descent, led by the honored scout and guide, Daniel Boone. In May 1804, immediately following the Louisiana Purchase, Lewis and Clark began their famous expedition from Les Petites Côtes. Before their return in September 1806, the name had been anglicized to St. Charles. The following year, 1807, Captain Meriwether Lewis was designated governor. In the first decade after the Louisiana Purchase, many settlers rushed to the territory, including Stephen Hempstead and his family. The arrival of the Hempsteads, unheralded at the time, was to change the newly incorporated town of St. Louis in ways undreamed of. Hempstead was a lifelong and devout Protestant. He kept careful entries in his journal about his church attendance. On March 31, 1811, he writes,
I occasionally attended Mass at the Catholic Church and discussed religion with itinerant Methodist and Baptist preachers, but sorely missed the discourses of the classically educated clergy of the Presbyterian and Congregational churches.
Several companies of Rangers, under the leadership of Captain James Calloway, grandson of Daniel Boone, Captain Nathan Boone, and the scout himself, Daniel Boone, who was 80 years old at the time, were organized to secure the country in all directions. Stone and log forts were erected at various points in which people could take shelter should an alarm be given. These included Daniel Boone Fort in Dart's Bottom, Howell's Fort on Howell's Prairie, Pond Fort on the Boone Slick Trail, Zumwald's Fort near present O'Fallon, Costley's Fort near Howell's Prairie, and there are other forts near Troy, Wright City, and the present town of Marthasville.
Presbyterian and Congregationalists supported missionary societies, which supplied ministers for the growing western frontier. First of the missionary preachers in St. Louis was the Reverend Salmon Giddings, commissioned by the Connecticut Home Missionary Society. Unable to establish a church in the Bonham area, Giddings rode to the Belleville settlement near present-day Caledonia, Missouri, where on the 3rd day of August, 1816, he brought together a small group of the faithful to found Concord Church, the first Presbyterian congregation west of the Mississippi River, followed by Bonham Church in November. On September 18, 1819, a week after his classmate David Tenney had organized the Brazo Church, a meeting was held at the home of John Naylor in the township of Dardenne, St. Charles County, under the leadership of Reverend Charles Robinson. The purpose? To form, by divine permission, a church to be established on the Presbyterian discipline and based on the scriptures of the Old and New Testaments, as illustrated by the American Confession of Faith. The first entry of the session's record includes the following minute.
Admitted members of this church: John Naylor and Mrs. John Naylor, his wife, James Naylor, his son, Mrs. Elizabeth McFeeters, Adam Zumwalt, Mrs. Zumwalt, his wife, Nathaniel Beverly Tucker and Mrs. Mary Tucker, his wife. The meeting was dismissed with prayer. Signed by order of the meeting, N.B. Tucker, Clerk Pro Tem.
Charles S. Robinson died February 25, 1828, just 24 days after the death of Salmon Giddings.
Soon after its organization, the Dardenne Church, a log building, was erected on a hill north of Dardenne Creek, about 2 miles south of the Boone Slick Road. The date of its construction is not known. An old deed shows a tract of 5 acres of land, part of an original Spanish land grant to Andrew Zumwalt, including the church now built, was given to the congregation by Andrew and Margaret Zumwalt in 1823. Signing the deed was Justice of the Peace Theophilus McFeeters, a member of the church. The deed was not actually recorded until August 29, 1838. So within 4 years after the church was organized, in the home of Mr. Naylor, the congregation owned a building and 5 acres of land. Little else is known about the original church building. The Boone Slick Road was one of the main thoroughfares east and west through the state. A regular stage line was established on this road. The most common means of travel was the old prairie schooners. Larger than ordinary wagons, they were covered with sheets of heavy canvas, stretched on bows, and pulled by 3 or 4 yoke of oxen to each wagon.
Presbyterians have always been strong supporters of education. Lindenwood College, the second oldest college west of the Mississippi River, was opened in 1827 by Major George C. and Mary Sibley and continues a covenantal relationship with the Presbyterian Church.
I was one of the first teachers on the prairie. My father, Francis Howell Sr., was a Revolutionary War soldier. Our family was one of the first families that came into the Louisiana Territory under the leadership of Daniel Boone. I was classically educated in St. Louis and have traveled extensively before I established a private school near the village, which was later called Mechanicsville. The school continued for several years educating children on the high prairie, both under my instruction and later under my assistant, Miss Bryant. I became an elder of the Dardenne Presbyterian Church and served as clerk of the sessions for many years.
The Howe, Costley, Harris, and McClure names are well known in St. Charles and St. Louis counties as the names of schools representing these pioneers in education. The name of Adam Lamb should be recorded with them. Lamb, a Scot from Edinburgh, came to Dardenne Prairie to spend the greater part of his life as a schoolmaster to the Watson family and the prairie at large. He taught in America, first in the Ellisville neighborhood, and moved on to High Hill, to Fenton, and to Potosi. He came to teach in the home of Reverend Thomas Watson on September 7, 1868, for a stipend of $150 per year. Adam Lamb died in 1878, much beloved as a teacher whose legacy lives on in the Adam Lamb Preschool and Academy of the Dardenne Church. His body was buried in Dardenne Prairie Cemetery in the Watson family plot.
On August 2, 1845, a second deed was made for an additional 2 acres of land, directly north and adjoining the lot of ground on which the old Dardenne Church now stands. This deed between John Nelson and his wife, Episcopalians, and the Dardenne Church, in consideration of $1, included use of the Nelson Spring for 1,000 years. This transaction was made for the purpose of building a church or house of worship for the use and benefit of said Dardenne Church and congregation. We know little about the log building, but we do know something about the brick church, constructed about 1844. People came to church on horseback. Men, women, old and young, with small children often riding behind. 100 or more horses would be tied about the church with 1 or 2 carriages and perhaps a few wagons. 2 services were held on communion days, morning and afternoon. The families came with food baskets and had dinner on separate tables scattered about the woods in picnic style.
Sunday school was a new concept in church services, and Dardenne Church was well ahead of the times in this interest. The charter was later changed in 1851 to be the Dardenne Church Sunday School.
Until 1841, the Dardenne Church was the only Presbyterian church in the country area of the county of St. Charles. Many members of this church lived in what is now the town of Defiance. It was a considerable distance to travel for church services, especially in inclement weather.
In 1844, Thomas Watson III was installed as the first pastor of the Dardenne Church. Born in New Bern, North Carolina in 1820, son of a newspaper editor and immigrant from the north of Ireland, Thomas Watson III headed into a newspaper career early. Thomas Watson II moved to St. Louis in 1837 to edit a Democratic paper called the Missouri Argus. Thomas III attended St. Louis University from 1840 to 1842. Graduating from Princeton Seminary in 1844, He was licensed to preach by the Presbytery of St. Louis and was elected pastor of the Dardenne Church by the congregation on October 6, 1844. Thomas Watson III and Nanny Campbell McClure were married on January 18, 1849. The history of the Dardenne Church is very unusual in that it has had only 4 installed ministers in its 175-year history. Reverend Thomas Watson, 1844 through 1888, Reverend Samuel McClure Watson, 1888 through 1925, Reverend Charles M. Bunce, 1970 through 1973, and Reverend Thomas L. Sale, 1974 to present. With the election of Abraham Lincoln, a Presbyterian, civil war came quickly. The dark storm clouds of war, which had been growing on the southern horizon for years, were at hand. On that fateful day in 1860, the first shot was fired in Virginia.
There came into being roving bands of desperate men, guerrillas who followed a pathway of violence under the cloak of fighting for a cause. Tradition tells how the church was visited by Union soldiers who stacked their arms in front of the building and came in for the services. Later that week, in April of 1862, the brick church was burned. The diary of Serena Costley indicates that even the rails of the fence were burned, suggesting arson with a vengeance. Whether the church was a hotbed of cessationist sentiments or its location was considered of strategic importance is not clear. The church, with people like the Bates and so many from Virginia and Kentucky, would suggest a serious split. But it is said that both sides insisted there would be no division of the church, no matter what the outcome of the tragic war. The Bonham Church was padlocked by the Unionists about this time, suggesting a concern that Presbyterians of Southern origin were suspect.
With the loss of the Dardenne Church building, services were held under the arbor, a shelter made of poles driven in the ground to hold boughs of green leaves as a roof to keep out the sun and light rain. In winter, the Lewis Howell School, or members' homes, served as the place of worship until the Rock Church was completed in 1868, built on land deeded to the church by Barton and Mrs. Bates. The Rock Church, constructed out of rubble stone, carried by wagon from Dardenne Creek, stood in marked contrast to the small but fine antebellum brick church. Cut stone was used for the front and corners of the building. The sanctuary and its furnishings would be considered primitive by today's standards, but it would serve the congregation for more than a century as the primary nave until 1985 and is now used for special services. Dr. Stuart S. Salmon continued the work of Mr. Watson and was instrumental in obtaining funds from Central Presbyterian Church in St. Louis for the remodeling of the Rock Church. During this period, conflict arose between the Dardenne Church and the Presbytery, which saw no future on the Dardenne Prairie for the Presbyterian Church, and talked of dissolving the congregation, which now numbered 9 people. The position of the Dardenne Church was significantly strengthened by the ordination as an elder on April 18, 1965, of Sally Ann Watson, great-granddaughter of Reverend Thomas Watson III. Ms. Watson attended the Presbytery as one of the first women in the St. Louis area serving as a representative of A session. As a vigorous advocate for Dardenne before the Presbytery, she appealed to the Bates Deed of 1868 with its reference to the trustees holding title to the property without the control, interference, or meddling of any presbytery, synod, general assembly, or other ecclesiastical body. The presbytery backed off its plan to dissolve the church and seems to have decided, if you can't lick 'em, join 'em, because it put up the money for the brick narthex, replacing the 1890s wooden narthex with wooden columns placed on a front porch. Mr. Charles M. Bunce began his work with the Dardenne Church as a lay leader. From 1967 until October 4th, 1970, he worked in that capacity. The same day the presbytery ordained him as a minister of the gospel, he was installed as the third pastor of the Dardenne Presbyterian Church. During his pastorate, a second trailer was added to accommodate the need for a Sunday school. New pews were placed in the Rock Church, and a robed choir, children's choir, and a youth group called the Presbyteans were formed. In June 1973, the Dardenne congregation was deeply grieved by the death of the Reverend Mr. Bunce, who served the congregation faithfully and tirelessly for 7 years. He was buried in the Dardenne Prairie Cemetery.
After a year's search, Reverend Thomas L. Sale, pastor of the church in Warren, Arkansas, was called by the Dardenne Church. He was installed as pastor by the Presbytery of Southeast Missouri on June 2, 1974, and became the fourth installed pastor in the church's history. The next 20 years saw explosive growth in the Dardenne Church, with membership climbing from 192 in 1974 to 1,055 in 1994. By 1985, the addition of the new complex was completed, including the new nave called the New Brick Church.
Dardenne Presbyterian Church is and has always been a congregation of friendly, caring people. The pioneer settlers who persevered in the face of the hardships of frontier life and the struggle for religious freedom are now buried in the Dardenne Creek and Dardenne Prairie cemeteries. As our forebears set before us an example of discipleship, we accept their blessings gladly. With God's guidance, Dardenne Church continues to answer the call to glorify God with worship and service. Make a joyful noise to the Lord, all the lands. Serve the Lord with gladness. Come into his presence with singing. For the Lord is good. His steadfast love endures forever, and his faithfulness to all generations.